Well, our big focus, Israel and Hamas agreed to a temporary ceasefire, opening a path to end 15 months of intense fighting in Gaza that has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians. This agreement, which the Israeli cabinet is yet to approve, is set to take effect on Sunday and see the phased release of 33 Israeli hostages as well as Palestinian prisoners, while Israel will also pull its troops from densely populated areas in Gaza. The US President, Joe Biden, took credit for the months-long negotiations, but analysts also pointed out to the incoming Trump administration's efforts to actually pressurize Israel on this deal. Israeli forces, however, are continuing with their attacks across the Gaza Strip, killing at least 30 Palestinians in the enclave since this agreement was announced. So the agreement is but a fragile reprieve lasting just 6 months, some analysts argue, and celebrations in Gaza were cautious as per multiple reports. Listen in to what the Prime Minister of Qatar had to say, followed by the outgoing US President's reaction and my colleague Sarah Coates' report from Tel Aviv.
دولة قطر وجمهورية مصر العربية والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الإعلان عن نجاح جهود الوساطة المشتركة بوصول طرفي النزاع في قطاع غزة إلى اتفاق بشأن تبادل الأسرى والرهائن والعودة إلى الهدوء المستدام وصولا لوقف دائم لإطلاق النار بين الجانبين.
I'd also note this deal was developed and negotiated under my administration, but its terms will be implemented for the most part by the next administration. In these past few days, we've been speaking as one team. This has been a time of real turmoil in the Middle East. But as I prepare to leave office, our friends are strong, our enemies are weak, and there's a genuine opportunities for a new future.
Celebrations right around the region after this ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas was announced by Qatar's Prime Minister after 15 months of fighting and more than 46,000 people killed in the Gaza Strip. Now, this ceasefire deal is expected to go into effect on Sunday, with 3 hostages released that day, another 4 released 1 week later. Now, this first phase of the deal will see 33 hostages released in total in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners being held in Israeli jails. Now, it is during the second phase that there will be discussions on how to permanently end this war, and it is during the second phase that soldiers will be released, male soldiers and also men under the age of 50. So once again, it certainly is good news for the region after 15 months of fighting, but in saying that, there is a lot of careful optimism and anticipation given that previous ceasefires or attempts to get them over the line have fallen over, but certainly this is good news that we're hearing this evening. Sarah Coates for NDTV, Tel Aviv.
And for further clarity, we have with us Middle East expert James Bowden and Ray Locker joining us on the broadcast. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for making time for us on NDTV. James, I'd like to begin with you first. Would you call this ceasefire deal fragile, reprieve? What do you think are the factors that will determine whether this ceasefire will hold beyond this proposed 6-week window?
Oh, it's absolutely fragile. And I think it was very appropriate to emphasize all throughout the reporting that, you know, this is the engagement, not the wedding. We have not gotten to the cabinet approval, and this could still be sunk in the cabinet tomorrow when they meet together. So again, as was expressed in the report, just very cautious optimism and thinking that it might go through, but it could still fall apart. And even in the run-up to the ceasefire, we have seen in other ceasefires that Israel has extensively bombed, especially in Lebanon, southern Lebanon and Beirut. And so if they do that same type of pattern in Gaza, it may undermine their efforts. It might actually break the ceasefire. So everything is just a very delicate process right now.
Ray, let's bring you in as well. Given the significant loss of life and destruction in Gaza, considering the emotional and psychological toll this war has taken, you believe Gaza is truly celebrating this ceasefire, or is the mood more cautious?
Well, I think they're cautious, but I think they're celebrating because it means, at least for temporarily, they'll get a respite from the constant bombing and attacks that they have brought upon themselves for the last 15 months.
But Joe Biden has taken credit for facilitating this ceasefire. But many reports also suggest, meanwhile, that the Trump administration may have played a key role in pressurizing Israel. Ray, how do you evaluate the diplomatic contributions from both the U.S. administrations in this agreement?
Well, I think Biden's been working for a long time to get to this deal. But the thing that the Israelis knew and Hamas knew was that Trump wanted the Israelis to do whatever it took to get rid of Hamas. So Hamas is looking at this saying it's January 15th. We got 5 more days to deal with Biden. And then after that, we got to deal with Trump. We don't know what he's capable of doing. Meanwhile, Trump and his team were saying to the Israelis, we want this to stop. And we don't know how much how patient we'll be. We don't want this to go on. And I think both sides looked at the future and said, it's better to deal with this now than wait 5 days.
Right. And James, how would you view the broader implications of this agreement in the context of Israel's military and political goals in Gaza? Do you argue that this agreement is simply a tactical move, or is there a genuine shift in Israel's strategy?
I see this as a possible net loss for Netanyahu, and I think that it's going to be a very significant step. I do think that they will likely resume the war. We have not seen any announcement of them withdrawing the declaration of war that they issued at the beginning. And I think it's very possible that they will go back in after the term of the ceasefire and continue the war because they've not met all of their objectives. And so I do think that there's going to be a reinitiation. During the ceasefire, though, there may be a significant amount of political combat and fighting within Israel, and that might change the game. It's a very dynamic situation there.
But Ray, let's bring you in here. What would you say then are the major hurdles that remain for any potential long-term peace agreement as far as this is concerned?
Well, on the Hamas side, you got to look at whatever leadership they have left and what they want to do. Do they want to continue to push Israel and, continue to be a terrorist organization as they have been? And on the Israeli side, do the right-wingers in the Netanyahu government want to keep pushing for total eradication of Hamas and claiming land in Gaza? Some people want all of Gaza, and those people often hold the balance of power in the Israeli government. So long term, I'm not real optimistic we're going to see peace, upon the land there for any time in the foreseeable future.
Right. James,
Definitely.
as we wrap, what do you think makes this agreement different? Could we see this as a sign of potential diplomatic breakthrough? Or would you assert that this is a momentary break in a much longer cycle of violence?
I think that this is a break in a much longer cycle of violence. My view of the Middle East and my experience with it over 14 years of research and study says that even if this gives us a prolonged pause, we are likely to see further issues grow out of this conflict that weren't resolved and will have to be readdressed through another conflict or two. So unfortunately, my optimism is very low at this point. And I do think that if we're not going to see something immediate, maybe a year from now, maybe 2 years, but there will be a renewal of violence.
Well, let's see what the Israel cabinet does today. Thank you so much, gentlemen, as always, for joining us on NDTV. Meanwhile, a peace deal for Ukraine would take months to work out. This is what advisors to Donald Trump have said. While the president-elect has promised a quick resolution to the nearly 3-year war, analysts as well as his associates now forecast a drawn-out timeline. Hopes for a deal within Trump's first 100 days in office are way too optimistic. This is what a former U.S. ambassador to Kyiv has said. And as Trump's inauguration approaches, Ukraine is responding more aggressively to attacks on its energy infrastructure. Kyiv this week, in fact, launched its biggest aerial assault on Russian territory since the invasion. A Russian security expert has said on record that Ukraine doesn't have much left to lose at this point, so they can just go ahead and take the gloves off. By the way, Joe Biden vows a peaceful transition of power to Trump, but he warns that oligarchy is taking shape in America as he delivered his farewell address from the Oval Office. Biden called on the Constitution to be amended to make clear that no president is immune from crimes that he or she commits while in office, alluding to the Supreme Court ruling last year that guaranteed broad executive immunity from prosecution in the US. But the congressional reaction, meanwhile, to Biden's speech is not exactly surprising. Democrats have lauded the outgoing US president, while Republican representatives wish him good riddance. Listen in to a snippet of his Oval Address.
Millions of Americans now have the dignity of work. Millions of entrepreneurs and companies creating new businesses and industries, hiring American workers, using American products. And together, we've launched a new era of American possibilities.
Well, in other news, Russian President Vladimir Putin may soon have discussions with newly elected US President Donald Trump, during which we are told he will demand that Ukraine never join NATO. This is what Bloomberg is reporting. But Putin's position also contradicts Trump's stated desire to end the war as quickly as possible and may be aimed at granting Russia more flexibility in terms of negotiations. Bloomberg's report, by the way, further noted that Russia's advances in eastern Ukraine have been slow and have come at a very heavy cost. Ray Locker's with us for further clarity on this as well. Ray, how realistic is this demand? And what would be the consequences for Ukraine's sovereignty and security if it were to accept such terms?
Well, I mean, first of all, Trump's promises to end the war immediately were never true. No one really took them seriously, and now they're logically backing away from them, so that makes sense. Look, Ukraine has to negotiate its own future. Trump can't do it for them. I don't think anybody would stand for that in Ukraine or in Europe. Right. And so, I mean, Putin pushed Ukraine in the arms of NATO, pushed Ukraine in the arms of the EU, and he can't really negotiate his way out of that. So, I mean, this may be his opening gambit, but this is not where it's going to end.
But Ray, how might an incoming President Donald Trump approach these demands, especially considering his prior skepticism about NATO and his stance on Ukraine? Could his leadership actually change the balance of power in the negotiations?
Well, it could, because he could drop support of Ukraine. And if Ukraine doesn't have the U.S. support, then they have to rely on Western Europe. And that's not as strong as a joint U.S.-European alliance in support of Ukraine. So that could alter the balance of power very unfavorably for Ukraine.
And with Russia's growing confidence on the battlefield, how much would you say if Putin's stance is shaped by military gains versus geopolitical objectives? And what do these demands signal about Russia's long-term strategy, especially as far as Europe is concerned?
Well, Russia, I think, is always going to be a threat to Europe as long as Putin's around. I don't think that Russia is necessarily gaining in the war against Ukraine. They're doing okay, but at what cost? I mean, they've lost so many people in a war that they didn't need to have. And it's really cost Russia a lot, and it's devastated Ukraine. So, I mean, in the end, what good did it do Russia?
Right. Well, we will, of course, track the latest updates with you, Ray. Thanks so much, as always, for joining us with your views.
Thanks, Parmeshwar.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump's pick for Attorney General, Pam Bondi, insisted at her Senate confirmation hearing that Trump had been targeted by years of investigations. But she pledged that she would not politicize or weaponize the Justice Department if confirmed as the country's chief federal law enforcement officer. The statements echoed Trump's claims that the Justice Department had been weaponized against him. Meanwhile, the other crucial story we're tracking, just over a week after U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan announced that Washington was finalizing steps to lift long-standing restrictions on civil nuclear cooperation with India, there's been a significant development. The U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security has removed 3 key Indian nuclear entities from its entity list. Now, these organizations are Bhabha Atomic Research Center, the Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research, and Indian Rare Earths Limited. They are no longer subject to export restrictions. And a little bit of context for you here. The entity list compiled by the U.S. Department of Commerce includes foreign individuals and organizations that face trade restrictions due to concerns about national security, terrorism, or weapons of mass destruction. Now, the removal of these Indian entities marks a key shift in US-India nuclear cooperation, potentially opening the door for greater collaboration between our two countries in the civil nuclear sector. And by the way, in a move that's raising tensions between the United States and China, China's Commerce Ministry announced that it has added 4 American companies to its so-called unreliable entity list. These companies are accused of being involved in arms sales to Taiwan, which is a region that China considers part of its own territory and stakes claim on it. The blacklisted companies, including Pacific Rim Defense and Summit Technologies, now face serious penalties. They will be banned from importing or exporting goods to and from China, and also prohibited from making new investments in the country. In fact, this move signals a sharp escalation in the ongoing tensions over Taiwan and US-China relations. By the way, in other news, Meta may need to roll back or pause some features in India due to an antitrust directive that bans WhatsApp from sharing user data with Meta for advertising purposes. Meta is challenging the Competition Commission of India's November directive, which accused it of abusing its dominance and coercing WhatsApp users into accepting a privacy policy that allegedly expanded data collection as well as data sharing. The CCI imposed a $24.5 million fine and a 5-year ban on WhatsApp's data sharing practice in India, which could affect Meta's ability to personalize ads on Facebook as well as Instagram. Well, news and updates continue in a moment, right after this very short break. Do stay tuned. Horrific news coming in from South Africa. At least 78 dead bodies have been retrieved from a discontinued gold mine in South Africa, where police cut off food and water supplies for months in what trade unions called a horrific crackdown on desperate people trying to earn a living. Police said that they have ended a rescue operation and believe they have brought out all the survivors and retrieved all the bodies from this abandoned mine, which is southwest of Johannesburg. In other news, Drake has filed a defamation lawsuit against Universal Music Group, the record label he and rival Kendrick Lamar share, over the latter artist's diss track, Not Like Us. The lawsuit, filed in a New York federal court, comes shortly after the Canadian rapper withdrew a legal challenge he made against UMG and Spotify, alleging that they artificially inflated the popularity of Kendrick Lamar's track.